Hello, and welcome to Based on Facts, where fiction and superstition meet logic and scientific facts, broadcasting on WELT 95.7 FM from the Allen County Public Library. The main topic that I'd like to discuss tonight is the militia standoff at Oregon's Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. So basically what happened there is a group of people led by the Bundy brothers, Ammon and Ryan, took over the refuge. They brought in their guns, luckily on a holiday weekend so nobody was there, brought in their guns and they occupied federal buildings. That's kind of a problem. That is technically considered trespassing and breaking and entering. That's a problem. Now luckily nobody was there at the time so they don't have to worry about having hostages or anything. But the unfortunate thing is that they're still breaking the law in order to try and make their point. And their point is that they are combating what's going on in Burns, Oregon, which was the nearby city. What was going on there was a protest for the Hammonds going back to jail. And the Hammonds were being sent back to jail because they were convicted of arson a number of years ago and were given minimal sentences. Okay, we're talking about arson that warranted a minimum 5-year sentence. Now, Dwight Hammond only served 3 months of that 5-year sentence and was released. His son, Stephen Hammond, was released after a year. So basically, they have to kind of make up for that remaining time frame on their minimum sentences. So that's why they were forced to go back to jail to serve the remainder of that 5-year sentence. A number of people gathered in Burns to protest this, a few hundred people, and the Bundy brothers were a part of that protest. But they splintered off with a number of other supporters, primarily militiamen, and they went off to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge to occupy it. In so doing, what they were able to do was start making demands for the Hammonds to be released from jail, along with other things, of course. The leading thoughts on the matter is that the Hammonds were kind of used as a scapegoat for the Bundys to start pressing their own agenda. All right, and their own agenda consists of the federal government trying to return more of their land to the people. And that's what they've explicitly stated in some of their demands. And what they call themselves, that militia group, is the Citizens for Constitutional Freedom. And so these guys have taken over the National Wildlife Refuge. They've occupied the Visitors Center. That's where they consider their headquarters to be. The watchtower there. They've taken the entrance sign, covered it with American flags, and have armed guards at the entrances. Now, fortunately, they are allowing reporters to come into the compound. And in fact, at one point, they even did allow reporters inside the buildings within the compound to kind of report on what's going on within each of the buildings. And what the reporters saw was basically what you would expect. You know, the people inside talking to reporters via phone, and so on and so forth. They also noticed that the people were kind of in need of food on occasion, so they were bringing in some pizza that was ordered from the local area, things like that. So they were definitely, you know, trying to live out their lives within the compound, but also trying to communicate with the outside world and keep an open line of communication with that. And that's actually very important. Very important to maintain that line of communication. And so that's what's kind of giving law enforcement officials some hope that this situation will resolve in a peaceful manner. Because each of these militiamen are said to be heavily armed. Okay, so we have to try to think about how we're going to defuse a situation without bloodshed. Because these guys are ready to stand their ground. They have stated that they're going to stay in this wildlife refuge for many years if need be, and are prepared to answer any violence that comes against them with violence. And that is a concerning situation because that can very quickly escalate into a situation where we have a lot of violence and gunplay and lost lives. And so the police kind of want to avoid that. And obviously the militiamen kind of don't want to die in the process either. So there's kind of this interesting situation at the moment where really the militiamen aren't causing any immediate damage. I mean, they might be busting up some of the locks on the doors and maybe eating some of the supplies there in the refuge, but they're really not threatening human lives at the moment. They're really not actively destroying a lot of property at the moment. So the police are kind of taking a very standoffish approach to this whole situation. Now, Ammon Bundy, the real leader of this whole movement, he states that they're really not considering themselves militia or terrorists, despite the fact their actions actually indicate that they are being kind of armed militiamen. They are being kind of terrorists because they're taking over a building and making threats, saying, hey, you want to bring in some guns and some firepower into this situation? We're going to answer that. That's kind of terroristic, actually. The fact that they are going that far and they've actually started threatening law enforcement and some of the civilians as far as taking that threat of violence to the next level. And that makes them kind of terrorists in the process, unfortunately. Now, what are they demanding? Well, obviously, we've already kind of mentioned they're demanding the Hammonds be released from jail, but really they're focusing more on the federal government releasing ownership of their lands to the people. All right. Now, people are already able to utilize the federal land to some degree because it's a wildlife refuge. Okay, so people are already allowed to go on to the land and hike and maybe fish and maybe hunt, given that they have the proper permits during the right times of year. Now, what these guys are calling for, what the Bundy brothers are calling for, is they're calling for the land to be completely released to the public. Okay, so no limitations on cattle grazing, no limitations on people going on there and being able to take wood resources, so they want to be able to log on there as much as possible. And so what's that going to end up with? Well, you're going to end up with a land that is barren of all life. Okay, because the truth of the matter is that if you give people the opportunity to do whatever they want on the land, they will do whatever they want on the land. That's the unfortunate truth of human nature. Okay, if you want to give people the right to come onto a land and pillage it to the most extreme case scenario, just let them log everything, mine everything, do absolutely everything that they possibly want to the land, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be no land left, and all of the species that may have been endangered at the time are now extinct because people have been allowed to go onto the land and do whatever they want on the land. Now, Ammon also clarified that he wants people to be able to use the land there freely from some kind of central point. So to that end, they've actually designed a Harney County Resource Center logo and a mock-up of that whole scenario. They've actually done that in case the federal government actually is receptive to their demands. So basically these guys have created a situation where they will be full willing to give over this compound if it goes back to the people. And they want that compound to instead of being called the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, they want it to be called the Harney County Resource Center. And they have everything prepped for that. They have the logo made up, they have everything in place so that they can return those land and resources to the people. And of course, like I said, what's going to happen with this Harney County Resource Center is that it's eventually going to be depleted to zero resources, because that's just what people do, unfortunately. Now, reporters, like I said, reporters have been allowed inside the refuge. They've mentioned the sighting of armed militia members, of course, but they've also noticed that Ammon Bundy and Ryan Bundy have been talking with their father about the whole situation, since Cliven Bundy was actually involved with a previous anti-government rally of sorts back in 2004 for some of the issues that he had with cattle grazing on federal land. So this is kind of been a perpetual saga for the Bundys, so to speak. The fact that they are very anti-government, because they see the government coming in, taking all the land, and not allowing the people to utilize the land. Well, the government tends to limit people utilizing the land in ways that they see will be destructive to the land. And for those of you who don't know, the destruction of the land can be very extreme in cases of cattle grazing. So when cattle come on the land, obviously they're hooved animals, so they're going to be destroying every bit of land that they touch in general. Aside from that, they also like to pick at and eat anything that is, 4 feet or lower. Okay, they will eat it all up. Every bit of vegetation they will consume. So that's pretty destructive to a national wildlife refuge that wishes to maintain a habitat that's pristine, that can provide regular amounts of hunting and fishing and just pure pristine nature viewing for the people, for the local people. But I don't know, the Bundys don't seem to be concerned about that. They more seem to be concerned about their cattle grazing rights. All right, so seems that they are very selfish in this matter, actually, not considering other people's needs or even the species themselves' needs in this whole situation. The thing that frustrates me personally even more is when they're talking about a biologist that was working at the National Wildlife Refuge. Okay, so they've taken over the center and all of the offices within it, and one of these offices belonged to Linda Beck, which was in fact a biologist in employment of the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, there at the refuge. And so they ended up taking over her desk and using it for their purposes, basically assimilating every resource on the refuge that they could to serve their purposes as opposed to the original purposes of the BLM. Now, the frustrating thing for me was when they started talking about her not being there to work for the people. Instead, she was actually a part of what's destroying America. And that's a problem with me. That rings a very harmful tone with me because I myself am a biologist. And granted, I'm biased. Okay, not going to say I'm not. But basically, biologists are providing more good for this entire country than most other professions. Okay, I'm sorry, but what biologists do tend to resound across every generation. Okay, because they're going out there, they're discovering new things, and they're preserving the few things that we do have, which is part of the National Wildlife Refuge's mission, which is why she's employed there on site. And so I believe it's very unfair for the Bundys to directly attack her, because honestly, she's doing more good than they are. Sorry, just have to say that. She's doing more good than they are. Now, the reporters also were able to talk with Ammon and Ryan and discuss what they thought, what those guys thought would be reasonable outcomes of the scenario. Now, Ammon said that he wouldn't resist arrest if, police were to come in and try to actively take him, but he would likely combat charges that he felt were unconstitutional. So what he would like to have happen, okay, other than being arrested, because obviously he doesn't want that, but what he would like to have happen is he would like to convene a grand jury to assess the lawfulness of the reserve's federal ownership, as well as, extend it to the Hammonds, just as a gesture because they were kind of friends. Extend it to the Hammonds' prosecution lawyer, who actually convicted them to go back to jail. Now, the Hammonds have since kind of pushed away the Bundys, all right? So they really don't want much to do with the Bundys at this time because the Bundys are taking actions that are pretty illegal, actually. So the Hammonds are kind of separating themselves from the Bundys as much as possible right now. Now, Hammond also admits to having second thoughts about this whole situation. He remembers saying things like, are we doing legitimate things that are going to be worth taking a stand on? Like, when is it appropriate to put ourselves and other people's lives on the line? Is this all justified? Are we going to look at each other at some point in the future and say, what are we doing? So it was actually good for the reporters to say those kinds of things because it shows that Ammon is an actual individual living human being. Right? The fact that he's having second thoughts about all this process, and yet he's still going through it. So it's very important to show that he's not just this robot militia guy that's going out and doing the things that he's doing, which is taking over federal buildings and threatening the lives of anyone who comes to tell him otherwise. Now, the police, as far as what they're doing about the whole situation, they aren't really doing much. They're very standoffish. David Ward of the county sheriff's office has kind of kept his forces out of the area, requested additional resources, of course, but the federal authorities have pretty much mimicked the same actions at the moment. They're very standoffish, remaining hands-off with the whole situation. They started gathering some resources in Burns, which is about 30 miles northwest of the compound, and they are trying to settle the situation peacefully. Okay? Because they know that these guys have threatened local law enforcement, threatened their children. So what the local community has done is they've actually closed down schools in the area, at least for 1 week, while we try to settle this situation out. Now, previously, Ammon had actually sent a letter to the sheriff in December asking why the Brothers in Blue take the people's money by force and then purchase military equipment and arms in the name of protecting the people, only to use it on the people themselves. Well, it's kind of the nature of the federal government, and those kinds of words are potentially interpreted as being fighting words, and may have foreshadowed the entire event that they just did here in January. So what they've done in the area, what the police have done in the area, is basically take all of their patrols that were once just single people going on a patrol and turn it into pairs of people on each patrol, just to increase security, make sure they don't lose anybody to the militia or other potential stragglers and protesters. So they've definitely tried to up the security in the area, but are once again trying to stand off and let the situation diffuse on its own, trying to let those guys question themselves and see, hey, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Is it worth it in the end? Those kinds of things. So they really are trying to let the situation get to a point where when the feds or when the law enforcement come into play, things don't escalate out of control and become a gunfight. Right? Because they really don't want that. That is the last thing that they want in the world. Now, the nice thing is that once again, they haven't broken too many laws in taking over this refuge. Okay, they've trespassed, they've broken and entered, maybe a couple other nitpicky things here and there, but really they haven't done too much now. So for them to give up right now, they're not going to get huge sentences in the end. And law enforcement is looking forward to that. They don't want to go and seek out people and charge them with 10 years for this, that, and the other. They want to settle a situation that's very hostile, that can get out of control as peacefully as humanly possible. They don't want a repeat of Waco, Texas, in '93, where there were dozens of people left dead, and the whole compound was just annihilated. All right, they don't want a repeat of that. So they're trying to stand off. They're probably going to start sending in negotiators into the situation to try to come to some resolution that's peaceful in the end. Now, as far as what politicians are doing about the whole situation, Senator Ted Cruz, who I'm not the biggest fan of myself, but a number of other people like him, he actually supports the rights of Americans to have a peaceful protest. Now the problem is that these guys are not doing that. Okay, he actually stated they don't have a constitutional right to use force and violence in this situation. So him and a number of other presidential hopefuls, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Senator of Florida, they are all hoping for a peaceful resolution to this standoff. So that's good. That's good to hear some positive things from politicians as far as seeing that this is a delicate situation that needs to be resolved and needs to be resolved peacefully. It's very reassuring to see that. So what was the original cause of this whole thing? Well, we already mentioned they were the Bundys were kind of a spur of a protest, a very peaceful protest, mind you, of the Hammonds being sent back to jail. Now, basically what happened was these guys were arraigned to report back to jail to serve the remainder of their 5-year sentence. And in so doing, that produced a lot of upheaval from the local population who thought that was kind of unfair. But, you know, okay, I could see how it might be unfair, but honestly, I think they lucked out quite a bit. And the reasoning for that is because those guys have done a number of sketch things in the past. They have a number of sketch things happen to them, granted. But I honestly think it was kind of justified for the federal government to send them back to jail. But we'll get to more of that later. As basically what happened from that protest was that the Bundy brothers took a number of other armed right-wing militia members from that protest in Burns for the Hammonds. They took those guys and a number of other people from other states and sieged the refuge on the day of the protest. Now, unfortunately, when those guys first entered Burns, they told law enforcement that they were just there to support the local ranchers in their whole protest of the Hammonds. But they were already coming into the situation knowing that they would eventually go from the protest to the National Wildlife Refuge. Okay, so they basically lied to police and other individuals there because they had ulterior motives in the whole situation. And in fact, these motives were even partially revealed in an email from December, at the end of December, where Ammon pleaded that all able-bodied men and women come to Burns, Oregon on or before January 2nd. Come prepared and be willing to stand. So he was already revealing his intentions right there in that email. Just saying that he wants a lot of people to come to Burns and be ready to make a stand. And guess what they did? They immediately went from that protest on the 3rd down to the National Wildlife Refuge and took it over and occupied it until their demands are going to be met. Now what's interesting about this whole situation is that Ammon Bundy, in particular, as much as he is anti-government, as much as he is like, well, we don't need any government at all, we can manage ourselves at the state and local levels, that's cool and that's great, but unfortunately saying those things kind of makes him a hypocrite. And that is because of the fact that back in 2010, he actually borrowed a sizable amount of money from the Small Business Administration. Okay? He actually took out a federal loan for $530,000 to support his trucking company. All right? His company does maintenance on trucks, and he needed a little bit of a loan to help that company. And that ended up costing the American taxpayers $22,000 for him to make that loan. So it's interesting that he's so anti-government until it comes to money. And then he's pro-government. He's like, oh yeah, give me that loan, just disperse the weight of that loan across the taxpayers, and hey, I'm a happy person. So in order for him to remedy that whole situation, he kind of needs to return that money to the taxpayers if he's to really stand his ground and be anti-government. He could potentially take a check, write it out to the taxpayers to the amount of $20,000 or whatever, and oh yeah, okay, then the situation would be resolved. That would be fine. He would no longer be a hypocrite for hating the government unless it pertains to money. Now, Other people have said that religion has been playing a fundamental part of this whole standoff thing. And that comes down to the fact that the Bundys are very strong Mormons, which a number of people are out there. And they've actually been trying to use the Mormon faith to justify their gun-toting, anti-government ways. Okay, because there are some stories in the book that are about government persecution and armed opposition and claiming land for oneself in the Book of Mormon. Now, Cliven's wife, Cliven Bundy, he's basically the father of Ammon and Ryan Bundy. Cliven Bundy, his wife, actually wrote an email in November that mentioned that the injustices of the Hammonds are a type and shadow of the suffering of the American people that will endure if we do not stand up and put an end to it. And this phrase, a type and shadow, is directly opted from the Book of Mormon. Okay? Because basically that's a situation where in the Book of Mormon, a prophet is describing what will happen to a king that treats his people unfairly. And so the Bundys feel like they're being treated unfairly by the federal government. And this is a cause that is echoed in the Hammond situation as well. Now, of course, there's another situation where Ammon Bundy quotes the Book of Mormon, saying that, nevertheless, when the wicked rule, the people mourn. Of course, the people he's referring to is talking about the ranchers and their conflicts with the government, because that's what his family's been going through. And that's, once again, opted from the Book of Mormon. But it's kind of interesting how people haven't made that reference since November. The Bundys haven't made references to the Book of Mormon since then. At least they don't seem to, since taking the Wildlife Refuge building. They seem to have used it to gain steam and support for their cause before that point. When it comes to land ownership, it gets pretty interesting in talking about it, because of the fact that, Senator Marco Rubio actually admits that the federal government controls a lot of the land out west, but that disputes about that ownership should be solved in a courtroom. That's the proper place to solve such disputes. But obviously the Bundys are not taking that route. And so that's where him, along with the other politicians, number of other politicians, are taking the stand that what the Bundys are doing is inappropriate, because they are doing things that are against the law and not necessarily following proper law procedure. But what's neat is that these guys are supported by certain other peoples in the area, as far as the ownership of the land belonging to the people. A butcher of the Hammond's cattle, Tim Slate, actually stated that the federal government wants to take over the state of Oregon and turn it into a park. So their movement does contain a number of other supporters in the area for different reasons. Ammon, of course, takes this one step further, claiming that the American people are wondering why they can't seem to get ahead, or why everything is costing more and you're getting less. Well, he's attributing that to the federal government and its use of the land and resources, as opposed to allowing people to use those land and resources. Which, of course, when you state it, really doesn't make a lot of much sense. Okay? Because America consists of more than just the West. Alright, and it seems like the West is where most of this stuff is taking place, because that contains a lot more unique habitat than the areas out east. And so for them to sit here and say, well, the downsizing of, or not downsizing, the downgrading of the American state is because of the federal government. People are worse and worse off lately because of the federal government and what they're taking. Well, that's not necessarily accurate. Okay, that's getting into very nitpicky political stuff that may not necessarily have a relevance in this issue. Now, of course, this whole land dispute about who owns the land, who should own the land, is very interesting because the original landowners here in the entire United States are the Native Americans. All right, they were here first. And what did we do? We came in and we pillaged and we destroyed and we claimed everything that they owned and restricted them to very small areas that they could own, just so we could further our own interests. So when the Bundys are sitting here, and they and the Hammonds and other ranchers are sitting here saying, well, my family has owned this area for over 100 years, so I should have rights to the land regardless. Well, that's not necessarily the case, actually, because Native Americans owned it for thousands of years before you came here. All right? So the Native Americans have actually started calling these guys a bunch of glory hounds and stating that, oh, boo-hoo, you want to gripe about your land being taken away from you. Well, guess what? We owned 1.7 million acres in what was called the Malheur Reservation until it was opened up for settlement. Okay, so in the exact same area where those guys are at, fighting for land rights in Oregon, there was the Malheur Reservation. It was owned by the Paiute Indians. And these guys were eventually, in fact, 1879, 500 of these guys were shackled and force marched 300 miles to Washington's Yakima Reservation. All right. So these guys are forcibly removed from their land and taken away. Now, fortunately, a number of years later, in 1928, they were granted some land, 10 acres in fact, near Burns, that they could call their own. And that's great, outstanding. The problem was that land was actually an old city dump. So the Indians, of their 1.7 million acres, they got 10 acres back. And they were allowed to come in and clean up the dump that was there, and drill a well, and build houses or homes for themselves. So I'm not sure how that compares to the ranchers, but I'm pretty sure the Indians got worse off. Just saying. Indians were much worse off than the ranchers were. So between me and the Native Americans, they're not getting any sympathy. All right, because ranchers have it pretty easy, actually, compared to the Native Americans. Now, as far as conservation is concerned, obviously land, when you're talking about land use, land preservation, a lot of that's going to be pertaining to conservation, because that's actually the number one thing judging whether or not a land area tries to become protected or not. To protect old growth forests, to protect a number of different species, including birds, tortoises, plants, all these different things. They need to be protected. And the best way to protect them is by the federal government grabbing that land and putting some laws and regulations on that land. Be like, oh, well, we can only permit so much hunting, so much fishing, not permitting cattle to graze on the land, and all this helps preserve the animals that are there. Because if we start allowing too much use of the resources, too much logging, too much ranching, that's when those animals that are already endangered are going to become extinct. And so we want to preserve that as much as possible. And it just blows my mind how nobody that I've seen online, none of the articles I've read online, have covered this topic of conservation. So it's so strong. Just imagine if, the cure to cancer, so to speak, could be found within the northern spotted owl, which is actually protected in an area just south of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in the Steens Mountains. Okay, that animal goes extinct, we don't have that cure for cancer anymore, because we have killed off that owl by allowing too much logging, by allowing too much cattle grazing. All right, those are the types of important things that we need to focus on in this scenario. Not just for the land usage, not just for people with the right to fish and hunt, but for the right to people being able to benefit from some of these animals that are on the verge of not being alive anymore as a species on this planet. Very important message right there. Now, another question is that some people have had is what this standoff has to do with race. Okay, because some people seem to think that had a bunch of black people gone into the refuge and taken it over, well, we would have just sent federal agents in with bazookas and just blown the whole place up. That's not the case. That's never been the case, and that is certainly not the case now. All right, because some people have been trying to compare these events to Ferguson, Missouri. What happened there? Now, that was a very unfortunate event where we had some uprisings and riots, and basically a bunch of people, most of them black or African American, most of them went around and started rioting. They started tearing up the place. They actually caused $4.2 million in damage by burning down 25 businesses, incinerating 14 vehicles, and causing 13 injuries. All right, that's not a drop in the pool. That's a pretty significant number of damages, of injuries, of destruction of property. That is huge. So yes, absolutely the federal government sent in riot police to calm the crowds. Now, once again, they send in police with non-lethal methods, okay, using rubber bullets, using tear gas, all right, and they tried to quell the uprising that was happening there. Now, of course, the uprising was over the shooting of an African American by a white police officer, but we're not going to get into that too much. The real issue is comparing that situation to the situation in Oregon right now. Okay, the fact that we have had probably a few broken locks, doors, maybe windows at the wildlife refuge, maybe the usage of some of the supplies there, food and water, of course, maybe some electricity, but really that's about all this militia has caused worth in damages. So you're thinking maybe 0.1%, okay, maybe about $4,000 worth of damages compared to Ferguson. So that really is a drop in the puddle. And these guys aren't causing injuries. We have 0 injuries so far. 0 deaths, 0 injuries. Nobody's getting hurt. So what is the priority? The priority is to make sure that continues. From the standpoint of the police, from the standpoint of law enforcement, they want to make sure that this trend of minimal property damage, of 0 lives and injuries lost, make sure that trend continues. Because if it does, then guess what? We have a glorious outcome. Something that's peaceful and not like Ferguson or not like Waco, Texas. All right. The other thing to consider is that these guys are actually allowing people onto the premises to communicate with them. All right. These militiamen are willing to talk. In fact, they love talking about their anti-government agenda. They love talking about their land usage rights problems. They love talking about these things. And that's great. People love talking and don't just sit there and point guns at and shoot other people. That's the situations where we can actually start getting somewhere. We can start benefiting from it, so to speak. So those are the situations where we can start going in a direction that will result in a peaceful outcome. Now, there are other writers online that seem to think that there is a whole lot of racial injustice going on right now. Okay, one in particular, Sean King, who writes this article that describes the media as arbitrarily defining heavily armed group of people based on their race. Okay, so if you have a black or Latino group that's heavily armed, they're called a gang. If you have a Muslim group that's heavily armed, they're called terrorists. If you have white people that are heavily armed, then they're called militia. There's not really a whole lot of reasoning for those designations, unfortunately, as far as supporting Sean King's point, because the definition for each of those groups emphasizes their motivations for different things. Since guns play a vital role in each of their group's purposes, each of those groups have different designations. So gangs are basically groups of people who have lived a life of violent street crime, illegal drugs, and they use the guns to help them lie, cheat, steal, and rape, and murder. Whereas terrorists are these guys who go through life trying to spread fear through violence. All right, and they use guns to that end to threaten or kill anyone they deem appropriate in order to further their cause. Now, militia members tend to be patriots, tend to be called patriots because they stand up for what they feel are the core values of the United States. All right, core tenements of the U.S. Constitution and its amendments. And they try to use guns to defend and uphold their Second Amendment rights. Now, those are just my definitions, okay? That's not to say that they're, official definitions in a book anywhere. But that's just what, for me, those different things mean, okay? Completely irregardless of race. So you have plenty of white people that are in gangs. We have plenty of, people that are terrorists without being Middle Eastern, right? And that's where these guys come into play, okay? Because gangs and terrorists tend to use their guns to seek out and make trouble, whereas militiamen typically bring the guns along in case they have to use them. Gangs and terrorists are classified as being highly aggressive, while militiamen are typically more defensive in their posture. Now, unfortunately, in this particular situation here in Oregon, the militia standoff there is a situation where men have trespassed, they've occupied a federal building, and they've promised to return the use of force with armed violence. So in this particular case, these guys have actually upgraded themselves to the level of militia terrorists because they're being passive aggressive and using their guns to stand their ground while breaking laws and while inciting fear in local civilians and the local law enforcement. So, as such, the CCF, these militiamen, should be treated as domestic terrorists that aren't necessarily looking for bloodshed, but they're prepared to oblige any bloodshed acts taken against them. So, as with stereotypical terrorists, the last thing you want to do is turn these guys into heroes or martyrs for their cause. So that's why law enforcement's kind of backing off and staying away from the situation, because you don't want to make a worse situation out of a situation that's just kind of bad, even though it's really not all that bad in the first place. Now, the other thing that was interesting about Sean King's article and some of his statements was that he didn't seem to understand that there's a difference between handling a situation where only one subject has a gun, okay? For him, he quoted the situations of John Crawford and Tamir Rice. Tamir Rice, of course, being the young boy who had a gun or something that looked like a gun and was gunned down by police. That's not the same situation we have here. Gunning down one individual is very different from gunning down a dozen or more armed individuals, which is the case with this in Oregon. So you increase the amount of collateral damage that can happen when you're facing a lot of different opponents than you would just facing one opponent. And that's something that the police know and understand very, very well. So they, once again, don't want to escalate the situation to gunplay. And if they were to do that, get to a point where bullets are fired from one side to the other or whatnot, you would definitely have a lot of collateral damage and injury because of taking on that armed militia in Oregon versus taking on one person or two people anywhere else. Another interesting thing that plays into this whole situation is the background of the Hammonds. Right? So a lot of people sympathize with their cause. They go in and say, oh, well, boo-hoo, the Hammonds have gone through a lot of federal persecution in the past. And you know what? That's right. It's absolutely right. The Hammonds have gone through a lot of tough times with the federal government. They've had to fight with the government over water rights, over land rights, over road rights. they've had to fight with them on those fronts. And you know what? That's unfortunate. But there was a court system in place that judged in the Hammonds' favor in every single case. Okay? When the federal government tried to come in and fence around the Hammonds' water source, the judge called that unconstitutional. All right? So the feds had to back off. That's great. That's success for the Hammonds. Right? Guess the feds were misinterpreting their amount of jurisdiction in that area. Tried to do the same thing with land and road rights. They tried to block off a road that the Hammonds kind of needed to access all of their property. And the judge ruled, hey, this road actually belongs to the county. So the feds backed off. So the Hammonds have gone through a lot with the government. But aside from that, they themselves have done a lot of things against the government that need to be settled in court as well. And in those particular instances, the court is judging against the Hammonds because they've done some wrong too, and they should be rightly punished as well. So, for instance, we have the Dusty Hammond situation. All right, Dusty is basically the nephew of Stephen Hammond, who with his father went to jail for arson. Now, Dusty Hammond was recalling a number of times in the past where he was mistreated or disciplined by Dwight and Stephen previously. Now, going as far back as 2004, Dusty basically decided to give himself a tattoo. All right. Some kids will do that. He was 16 at the time. It happens. So he basically etched the initials S and J on his chest, and his family learned about this and didn't particularly approve. They said that this process of making a tattoo on his chest would negatively impact the family. It would basically disgrace them. So they had to figure out how to go about removing these tattoos off of his chest. And the best thing that they could come up with was having Stephen go and apply sandpaper repeatedly to those areas on his chest. So, Stephen does it. He spends 10 minutes taking sandpaper to Dusty's chest and more or less successfully removes the tattoos, just replacing them with these giant scabs, these bleeding scars on his chest. What was great about that is that it finalized with Susan, who is actually Dwight's wife, so basically Dusty's great aunt. Susan directs Dusty to clean his sores with alcohol and not have a pity party. And that this whole punishment was done to teach Dusty to respect his body. Now, through this whole situation, while Stephen was sanding Dusty's chest, Susan stayed for the whole time. All right. I don't know if she enjoyed it. She just insisted on being there and watching the oversight, giving oversight to the whole situation. I don't know. But Dwight actually left the room halfway through. So does that mean that he didn't approve of the process? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Just thought that was interesting, especially when it came to the results afterwards when Stephen was like, well, I sure hope that sandpapering takes off the initials, because if not, I'll just have to fillet the initials off your chest. All right, so Stephen was willing to go ahead and take a knife to his nephew's chest to cut off that tattoo that he made at home. A little mind-blowing to me. That's a little like some jigsaw stuff right there. That's pretty crude. Now, luckily, after Dusty was at school for a little bit, somebody noticed those marks on his chest. And they actually called in the Harney County Sheriff to come into the school and interview Dusty about his injuries, because they could tell that they were not exactly the result of an accident. All right, they're very purposefully created, very purposefully made, and we need to figure out what the story was behind those. And so Dusty spilled the beans. He admitted that Stephen had sandpapered his chest. Now, what's interesting is that this led to other admissions by Dusty about certain other activities he was involved in with his family. Most notably activities that the Hammonds were just sent to jail for. So things regarding the arsons many years ago. And Dusty recalled that Stephen had instructed him to light the whole country on fire and to take a box of matches and walk through the grassland to set it on fire. And that was after Dusty had been taken on his first deer hunt. Now, Dusty himself didn't find any deer, didn't shoot any deer, but he knows a number of other people in the hunting party did. And so he was being instructed to light the area on fire using matches by Stephen to cover up the evidence of their deer poaching. And that's why they got charged for arson. That's one of the charges for arson right there, is that situation where Dusty was taken out for his first deer hunt and they collected some deer and they didn't want the government tracking on to what they were doing. They didn't want any evidence left behind of their poaching activities. So they lit a fire, burned up all the evidence. Now, there were other occasions where Dusty was involved with a punishment from the family. Most notably when he was found with alcohol, Steve actually drove him out 10 miles from the ranch and made him walk back. All right, that's not a big deal. I've walked 10 miles. Not a huge deal. Now, there was another time later after that Dusty was found with tobacco. And Steve actually forced him to consume 2 cans of Skoal smokeless tobacco and then make him walk 10 miles home. All right? So eat 2 cans of tobacco and then walk home. That sounds like I'm going to puke at least a few times on the way home. That seems like a bit of torture. But still, not with, those seem within the realm of reason, so to speak. Now, there was another situation involving Dusty where he basically was talked to by Stephen that if he had been home when he was confessing everything to the sheriff, Dusty would have been either beaten so bad that he would have regretted the rest of his life, or he would have been killed. Okay, so Stephen was very, very agitated that Dusty confessed all this stuff to the cop. And in fact, when Stephen was talking with the cop himself, the cop was sitting here directly asking him questions related to Dusty, saying, hey, who sandpapered Dusty? And he asked this question 10 times, and each time Stephen and Dwight kind of avoided the question. They started talking about Dusty, started talking about some of the background and such. And it's just, it's frustrating because they kept avoiding the question and not answering the sheriff's inquisitions there. And that indicates to me that they're absolutely guilty of everything that Dusty is saying, because it tells me that Dusty is telling the truth. And so those things definitely play into that as well. Now, previously, back in 2014, Bundy's, namely Cliven and Ammon, actually were in a situation where they were in a standoff with the feds. So essentially, Cliven had been allowing his cattle to graze on federal land and had accumulated as much as $1.1 million in fines for doing that. That's a bit of a problem. And what's funny is that he still has only paid about half of that back to the feds since 2014. And so it's interesting to see Ammon involved in this particular situation in Oregon, because Ammon was actually the person who was tased twice during this protest. All right. And his sister, Margaret, was actually thrown to the ground during this protest. So it was primarily the Bundy family that was responsible for trying to make this protest back in 2014 violent in the first place. And that does not sound good for the future of this protest. If those were the people that were trying to be violent back then, are these going to be the people that are going to be trying to be violent this time around? And that's the concern for police right now. What's going to happen from this point forward? And so we're just going to have to wait and see how things line up, where they end up with the whole situation. Hopefully it all resolves peacefully. You know, that all depends on how the Bundys are going to take it from this point forward. If they're going to escalate it into violence, or if they're going to calm down, if they're going to come to their senses, if they're going to reach some sort of compromise with the federal authorities and give up the refuge without necessarily meeting any of their demands that they originally had. Because they seem to be kind of demanding violence, or at least things that kind of lead to violence in the first place. So hopefully that whole situation can work out peacefully, and we can move on from here, because this situation has just been ridiculous and has really occupied news headlines in previous week or so. And so I'm really hoping everything works out. Best of luck to everyone in that area. I hope nobody gets hurt. Thank you so much for listening to Based on Facts, and I will tune out for this week. So have a good one. Thanks.